Welcome to Talking Business Asia. I'm Mariko. It's one of the most controversial Olympics ever staged. Delayed by a year, held during a pandemic, and with very little public support. The controversy surrounding the Tokyo Games has only increased with some confirmed cases of COVID-19 inside the Olympic Village. And athletes and team staff members are also self-isolating because they may have come into close contact with someone who's tested positive. What was supposed to be a celebration of triumph over adversity and friendship through sport and the pinnacle of athletic achievement has now exposed some of the biggest problems facing the modern Olympics. For years now, there have been questions over whether the Olympics business model with a different city hosting the Games is broken. And now Tokyo is hosting the event against the backdrop of rising COVID cases in the country. Our Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes explains why this particular Games have become so controversial.
When Tokyo got the Olympics back in 2013, there was genuine excitement here. I saw grown men crying with joy. But that was before COVID, and that has really changed everything. Firstly, last year they had to postpone the Games, and then at the beginning of this year, COVID rates in Tokyo really started picking up. More people were dying, and that really changed public opinion against the Games. Up to 80% of people told opinion polls they wanted the Games either postponed again or completely cancelled. The reason is people here are scared. Specialists were saying the Olympics could be a super spreader event, and vaccines here have been extremely slow to be rolled out. Even today, barely 20% of Japan's population is fully vaccinated. So why have the Games gone ahead? Well, from the International Olympic Committee's point of view, it's about the money. The IOC gets most of its revenues from broadcast rights and from sponsorship, so no Games, no revenues. The Japanese government's position is slightly more difficult to explain, but many people here say Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has decided to go ahead despite the risks because a successful Olympics is his only chance of being re-elected in the autumn. Cancel the Games now and his political career is finished. Unfortunately for Prime Minister Suga, in the last month or so, COVID infection rates have begun to pick up again, and so he has been forced reluctantly to impose a new state of emergency on Tokyo, and because of that, spectators have also been banned from Olympic venues. For the IOC, that really doesn't matter. They still get their money. But for the poor Japanese taxpayer, it means $25 billion or more has been spent on hosting the Games, but they can't go and watch it. There are no ticket revenues. There are no foreign tourists spending money at hotels and restaurants and bars. And so from a financial point of view for Japan, this most expensive Summer Games ever is a bust.
As Rupert said, the cost of hosting the Olympics is huge. So what's the attraction? Well, for many host cities, it's global prestige, national pride, and the promise of tourism dollars. In this region, Seoul, Sydney, and Beijing have hosted the Summer Games. Our correspondents report on the legacy the Olympics have left on those cities.
When trying to weigh up the costs versus the benefits of something like the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, it really is difficult. On the one hand, it cost an absolute fortune. The government spent $6.8 billion. That's just on the sporting side. All up, more like $40 billion. On the other, it was also a global advertisement for this city. Public transport was overhauled. Now, ticket prices may not have covered that expenditure, but having a vast, efficient public transport system in a city of 20 million people, the economic benefits there, well, they're incalculable. As for something like the Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium, it hardly gets used these days, other than by Chinese tourists who come along to buy a ticket and go in and have a look. However, it's about to take centre stage again for the opening ceremony and closing ceremony of the Winter Olympics when it's held in February in this city. In fact, 4 other facilities built for the Summer Games will be reused for the Winter Olympics, including the Water Cube, which will host the curling. China is not a country which has many mass sporting events, not like other countries. So the authorities have had to find other uses for former Olympic sites. But the Winter Olympics, they have been fortunate. to have facilities already built for the summer games which they can reuse. As for the likes of the downhill skiing or snowboarding, well, the hope is that there'll be a wave of enthusiasm for winter sports here following the 2022 Games, and that those sites will never go underused.
The Sydney 2000 Olympics were seen as a great success, especially with Australia's gold medal triumph on the track and in the pool. And here at Olympic Park, which before the Games was a toxic wasteland, sports facilities and stadiums are regularly being used for competitions, recreation and entertainment. It's also a suburb now, home to thousands of Sydney-siders, and a part of it is also now being used as a vaccination hub for COVID-19. So how much did the Sydney Games actually do for the economy? Well, that is still a debate. A predicted 7 billion Australian dollars boost never really materialized. In fact, there is a study that says that it's had a negative impact on the economy. But as a sporting event, it's done a lot for the city's profile. It propelled Sydney on the world stage as an international city that is capable of putting on a well-organized and a safe event. It was also around the same time that China's newly affluent population were looking for places to go on vacation and to send their children to study. So international education and tourism were big propellers and big drivers to Australia's growth in the past 2 decades. We've recently learned that the Olympics are coming back to Australia, specifically in Brisbane and southeast Queensland in 2032. It will be the first Games under the new IOC policy to keep the costs down and not make the event a financial burden on the host city. So it will be more temporary venues, a smaller athletes' village, and no new Olympic stadium. More, the money will go to roads and other infrastructure projects that are already in the development plans of the area. Organizers say that the budget is going to be about 1/3 of that for the Tokyo Olympics.
As we've heard, the intangible factors have often been the main appeal of hosting the elite sports event, despite the spiraling costs. But as the Tokyo Olympics demonstrates, what happens when those benefits aren't so obvious anymore? And is there an alternative to how the modern games should be staged? Professor Andrew Zembelis is an economist who studied the Olympic Games closely, and he explains why they've become so expensive to stage.
One factor is that in order to have a city sign all of the contracts with the IOC and commit itself the way it's required to financially, you've got to convince politicians that it's worth doing. And the best way to do that is to underestimate the real costs. Another reason is that traditionally the Olympics have been bid upon starting about 9 years before the actual Olympic Games happen. When you're looking at a 9-year time frame, costs change, and generally in the 21st and 20th centuries, when costs change, they go up. A third element is that, unlike with many building projects, where you don't really have a definitive date when absolutely the building has to be ready, in the case of the Olympics, there's a hard deadline. And so what happens when you have a hard deadline like that, a hard time deadline, is the construction companies have to prioritize the shipment, the movement, delivery of materials and of labor. And when you do that, sometimes you're telling labor they have to work overtime, maybe even double the number of hours they work in the days leading up to the games. And so that raises costs. A fourth reason is that there tends to be quite a bit of corruption in these hosting activities. The people who are in charge of doling out the contracts often have side deals under the table with the construction companies that are going to get the deals. And so that also can raise costs. Still, another possibility is you can have mismanagement. There's an enormity of projects here. You know, to host the Summer Games, you're looking at roughly 40 venues, 40 athletic venues, and you also have, of course, the Olympic Village and the Media Village and ceremonial space. So you put all those things together, and you get these very appreciable and consistent cost overruns. Sometimes the cost overrun might only be 30, 40, 50%, but sometimes it could be several fold. And as we see in the case of Tokyo, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 fold. The games in Montreal back in 1976, they had a 9-fold increase in costs above the initial bid.
And surely this has an impact on future cities wanting to host the games, given the financial implications.
As the games have expanded and the costs of hosting have gone higher and higher, and one of the costs that has gone sky high is security costs since 9/11. And as they go higher and higher, there are fewer and fewer cities that are interested in bidding. Accordingly, the IOC has been somewhat embarrassed in recent years, where there was only 1 or 2 bidders left at the end of the competition. They're accustomed to having, or at least what they would like to have happen, is to be 5 or more bidders, and then they hand out the prize, and it looks like a wonderful prize because you beat out your competitors. But if there's only 1 city or 2 cities at the end of the day that say they're willing to host, and if those cities, as was the case with the 2022 Olympics, the Winter Olympics that are going to happen in Beijing, there are only 2 cities at the end of the day that were willing to stay in the competition, to get the hosting rights. And one was Almaty, Kazakhstan, and the other was Beijing. And they're both terrible choices because they both have terrible human rights records. But the IOC had no choice. And it was very embarrassing to them. It was very embarrassing to them to have only Los Angeles and Paris bidding for the 2024 games. One of the reasons why they handed out the 2028 games to Los Angeles back in 2017 is because they were concerned that if they tried to hold another bidding, that nobody would be interested. So what the IOC has done is they've put it all behind curtains. This is a very dynamic and difficult situation for the IOC. It's made worse by what's going on with Tokyo. There's lots of scrutiny about whether the IOC really cares about world well-being the way it says it does. It's not going to play well.
Is the reputation really of the Olympic Games, has that already been damaged?
Oh, I think it's definitely been damaged. And that's one of the reasons why they don't have very many cities bidding anymore. So it's definitely been damaged. The question is whether or not it gets blown up, whether or not it simply vanishes, that the Olympics have been so mismanaged and so poorly handled that nobody will want to host them anymore, and they'll have to reinvent a new modern games the same way they were reinvented in 1896.
What, in your view, is the solution here?
I think the obvious solution, the one rational choice here, is to have one permanent host of the Summer Games and one permanent host of the Winter Games, so that a new city every 4 years doesn't have to rebuild the entire Olympic apparatus, the Olympic Shangri-La with 40 venues in the Summer Games. It's just a waste. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of materials. It's not good for the environment. Why do that? You know, when the modern games were begun in 1896, we didn't have international jet travel. We didn't have international telecommunications. So in order to engage the whole world in participating in and enjoying the Olympics, you had to move them around. It's no longer the case that they have to be moved around. Everybody in every corner of the world can stream the Olympic Games or could watch them on television now. We don't have to move them to a new city.
That was Andrew Zimbalist. It's not just a financial burden put on host cities to stage the Games. Critics say the Olympics have become too much about making money through broadcasting rights and sponsorship deals. That's coming up next.
I'm a nurse, and hospitals are overwhelmed, so I don't think it makes sense to go ahead with the Olympics.
I think we have to live with COVID. Major League Baseball just had its All-Star game, so I think Japan should go ahead with the Olympics too.
The number of new infections is rising, so it's worrying to have many people arriving from overseas. I know they have to quarantine, but I don't think the rules are that strict.
Join our teams in Tokyo throughout the Games for daily analysis and all the talking points from the events on BBC World News and BBC Sports Online.
Having a global perspective creates a deeper understanding. Because in our connected world, all news is international.
And to answer your direct question, we have a deal.
So, for in-depth analysis
of the biggest stories from the US and around the world.
And here is another army ambulance bringing in more COVID victims.
Join our team
and find out what is really going on.
BBC World News America.
Welcome back to Talking Business Asia. I'm Mariko. The last time Japan held the Summer Games was in 1964. It was in October when the weather was cooler, so having the games here now has raised concerns that the intense heat and humidity of the Tokyo summer could pose a serious risk to athletes. But when the games are held, all has to do with the global sport calendar. These are the major events which matter to American broadcasters, and there's a gap between late July to August. It's an ideal time for those broadcasters which pay billions of dollars for the rights to show the Olympics. That often means they have enormous influence into how the games are run.
Broadcasters provide one of the two biggest revenue sources for the IOC. So the organization does want to keep the broadcasters as happy as possible, and particularly the broadcasters from the countries that are paying the most for broadcasting the Olympic Games. So when NBC would like the swimming finals to take place in the evening in the US time zones to maximize viewership and thus sponsors, it's hard for the organizers to go against that. You know, they want to keep the viewership and sponsorship numbers as high as possible as well.
Aside from broadcasting money, corporate sponsorship is another huge income generator for the Olympics organizers. In recent games, there have been more Asian sponsors, household names like Toyota and Samsung. Alibaba, for example, is providing the technology infrastructure for the hundreds of media companies covering the event. Another Chinese firm, Mengniu Dairy, also teamed up with Coca-Cola to sign a sponsorship deal with the IOC worth $3 billion. And for this year's event, Japanese companies have gone all in, making it the most heavily sponsored event in sports history by far. But those sponsors have been facing backlash from the Japanese public who oppose the games, prompting Toyota to cancel all of its Olympics TV ads. NTT is the country's biggest telecoms operator, and it's one of the local sponsors. The company told the BBC it has no regrets about being an Olympic sponsor and that it'll work with the organizing committee to achieve the goals of Tokyo 2020.
5G と超高臨場間通信技術
NTT had planned to show off its augmented reality technology during the sailings events at the Games so spectators could watch the races up close, as if they were on the water near the competitors. Shingo Kinoshita is the executive research engineer at NTT, and he explains how they've been adjusting to the last-minute changes.
Unfortunately, with the decision not to allow any spectators, we cannot get them to enjoy it. But there will still be athletes, their staff and other sailing officials who can experience it. Thousands of professionals. So we'll continue with our plans so that they can experience our idea of the future technology. But this decision also means that athletes cannot hear anyone's cheers as they compete, especially for foreign athletes, but also for Japanese athletes too. So we want to use our big high-resolution display to show their fans back home and their families so that it can bring encouragement to the athletes.
For companies, an Olympic sponsorship deal is considered one of the biggest. Michael Payne has negotiated many of these agreements and explains why we're seeing more Asian companies as Olympic sponsors.
I think Samsung was the first major mover coming out of Korea, and Samsung had made it very clear that they wanted to use sport and the Olympics as their marketing platform. And the results were incredible. This is back in '96. Samsung at the time was not renowned as a major innovator or maker of mobile phones. I think on their global branding, they were not even in one of the top 100 companies in the world. They became an Olympic partner, and within 2 years, their global branding recognition jumped from one of the top 100 companies to under the top 20. The situation with Alibaba and Jack Ma was similar. Just the discussions with Jack were much quicker, because he immediately understood the potential partnership with the Olympic Committee as a game changer and catalyst for what they wanted to achieve at Alibaba, not just on the e-commerce platform, but with cloud. And if you look at what Alibaba is doing in Tokyo with the IOC in broadcasting, it is a complete transformation of the future of broadcasting.
But I guess because of this public opposition, some people have started writing to the sponsors like Toyota and other Japanese companies which are sponsoring the games. And of course, you also have the Beijing Winter Olympics, where the human rights issues in the Xinjiang region is becoming a big concern. Some people calling for the boycott as well. Is now being an Olympic sponsor maybe not exactly a safe bet as it used to be?
No, the returns, the opportunities are still incredibly strong. And there's always been lobby groups using the Olympics to make their voice heard. You go back 30, 40 years with the era of the boycotts, and the different groups were always petitioning the IOC or the sponsors to change policy. But the results for the sponsors have been very powerful, and that's why they've continued. And the partners, most of the top sponsors are actually renewed with the IOC out till 2028. And I was involved last year in brokering the new deal for Coca-Cola and the Chinese dairy company Mengniu out until 2032. So the commitment, the investment, and the return is still very powerful.
The next city to host the Summer Olympics is Paris in 2024. The IOC says it'll be more environmentally sustainable, and that includes finding ways to put a cap on the rising costs. Hugh Schofield looks at how the city plans to make the Games less expensive.
The hallmark of Paris is supposed to be sobriety, restraint, and above all, environmental responsibility. Thus, 95% of sporting events in 2024 will take place in venues that already exist. Thus, the carbon footprint of Paris is supposed to be reduced by 50% compared to previous Summer Olympics, and the cost compensated for by offset programs which will be created around the world, in fact. I might add that the River Seine here is supposed to have been sufficiently cleaned up by 2024 that some events might take place in it, for example, the triathlon. Now, it's all like that because, frankly, public opinion in Paris and in France generally was skeptical about the Olympics, about an old-style Olympics, expensive, showy, flashy. And they would not have been welcome here without this commitment to a new era. Will it work? Will it be sustainable? We'll have to see. I would simply say that from now, people here are pretty optimistic, but they've been watching Tokyo and they know that in this world, a bolt from the blue like COVID can leave the best laid plans in tatters.
That's it for this edition of Talking Business Asia. I'm Mariko Oi. Send me your thoughts. I'm at BBC Mariko Oi. From me and the team, thanks for watching.